Good morning, Doug. Today, I want to talk about purges, and specifically, there seems to be the Democrats that are in power now seem to be taking this all very seriously. This objective of eliminating the competition. And I was trying to think of what period this was like historically, and I was reading about the Soviet periods with the Bolsheviks doing some purges, and then stumbled across this McCarthyism again, what happened in America. And it was something that I had very little historical understanding of. And I want to explore that with you and understand what the parallels to that might be today and to see if it helps us understand what might be happening now at all.
Right. Well, of course, the McCarthy thing was back in the 50s, and I was just a kid then. So I don't have much firsthand recollection of it. But um, I think this is much more serious because that was just taking place in the Congress, where McCarthy was having his hearings to root out communists in the US government who at that time were viewed, and I guess many of them were, actual Soviet agents. So I guess he went too far. But on the other hand, uh, the fact that there are more communists in American universities today than there probably are in all of Russia shows that perhaps he wasn't that far off, although he had real stylistic problems, much like Trump has real stylistic problems. But okay, uh, look, history repeats itself constantly, and I think McCarthyism was a rather minor misadventure, well intentioned, because how can anybody not think that communists were, it's actually an evil doctrine. I mean, it's totally antithetical to everything that Western civilization holds good and in honor. So yeah, I'd say it was evil because it was actively destructive, as it's proven absolutely every place where it's been implemented. So it's too bad that McCarthy has such a bad name because he saw an evil, tried to extirpate it, but well, what are you going to do? It's the bad guys have total control of the philosophical battlefield at this point. So I'm not sure if it'll ever be redeemed.
Well, I
McCarthy.
think one of the
Not,
interesting
not,
things
that
about
not that I'm defending him. I mean, he was apparently a pretty obnoxious and anti-intellectual person himself, and probably just an opportunist. But the good news is he was anti-communist, and there were communists. So
Well, the thing that I was thinking about with it is that, of course, the he was targeting communists and used the power of his Senate position, and then ultimately brought in the FBI on it, but more than like the from what I was reading about it, more than just the what was happening from the government perspective is that the corporate America and the American people got behind this idea that if you were branded a communist or a sympathizer of a communist, if you had associations with people who had been identified as communists, then you would get blacklisted. And so there's the famous thing about the people in Hollywood that were blacklisted, but I really think those were relatively minor in comparison to the people in normal industry and in education that got listed that way. And of course, again, communism obviously all is bad, obviously. But the thing is that I just think that this same approach seems to be being used against not communists this time. It probably is going to be used against the Trumpsters this time. The same sort of approach, maintaining of lists, blackballing people so that they cannot work in certain jobs or industries.
that definitely seems to be the case. I mean, look, every time you have a revolution, uh, it seems like these things get out of control. I mean, I've said this a number of times before on our podcast as well as elsewhere that when Louis the XVI was overthrown in 1789 in France, if I'd been there, I would have said, that's a good thing. But by the time the Reign of Terror ended in 1793, they were guillotining everybody, including previous revolutionaries. There were like 20 or 30,000 people in France that were guillotined, and a whole bunch that were torn limb from limb. So, these things get out of control sometimes. And the revolution famously ate its own when Robespierre himself, who was the leader, was killed. And it was a replay in Russia in 1917. And once again, if I'd been there, I would have said, yes, it's very good to get rid of Nicholas II. But then it got worse when, Lenin and Trotsky, and Lenin was, went after Trotsky, and then Stalin went after all kinds of right-wing deviationists, although that's kind of a Chinese term. And, after the Reichstag fire in Germany in 1933, that incident was used as an excuse for Hitler passing all kinds of draconian laws. And my guess is that I think it was a minor incident, frankly, that took place on the 6th, and probably a false flag operation by a bunch of Antifa and BLM guys that, cleverly integrated themselves with the Trumpers. I mean, Republicans, aren't violent. They're, kind of salt of the earth country club types. So I think that was rather clever on their part, just like, Hitler was in some ways in back of the Reichstag fire, but he certainly used it to his advantage. So this is pretty much the same thing. Have you heard that there's a massive domestic anti-terrorism bill that's already been put together?
I heard references to that, and actually I shared with you just before this call a editorial in the Washington Post from Hillary that says, obviously calling Trump out, calling white supremacy out as a major problem that needs to be tackled. She says, of course, Trump needs to be removed from office. He needs to be impeached, is what she says, and that the members who supported him of Congress should resign. But she says that alone won't remove white supremacy and extremism from America. She goes on to say, there are changes elected leaders should pursue immediately, including advocating new criminal laws at the state and federal levels that hold white supremacists accountable and tracking the activities of extremists such as those who breach the Capitol.
Well, just as after the event of 9/11, and it's still unclear to me exactly what happened and exactly who was behind it. And there's so many details. It wasn't but a couple of weeks later that this massive Patriot Act, what was it, 2,000 pages? It was gigantic.
It seems small these days, though, Doug. Every bill is over 1,000 pages anymore.
That's true. That's true. And then later on, members of the deep state go picking through it to find something that minor, that you never even, if you're reading it, you wouldn't even notice it. And they pick it out and use it to their advantage. So this law, I understand, is rumors, who knows what the facts are, is at least that size, and it's going to be about domestic terrorism. So this really is the Reichstag fire moment, I think, now that the ultra-leftists are in office and the racists are in office. I want to define racism for a moment. It's not necessarily somebody that hates other races or discriminates against other races. A racist, I think, is best defined as somebody who views everything in his life through the filter of race. I mean, there can be perfectly good reasons why you might be a racist. I mean, living in Chicago, if I was a white guy in the ghetto, yeah, I mean, I would be prejudiced against black people because chances are if I walked out in the streets, I was going to get killed, okay? Well, that's different from viewing everything But if I moved out of that part of Chicago, it wouldn't make any difference anymore. But racism is viewing everything through the prism of race. And that's what these people are. The left have turned into racists. But this time, it's anti-white people as opposed to anti-black people. Or in California 100 years ago was anti-Oriental people. So
Hmm. How do you differentiate? Because they aren't using racist anymore. They're using the term white supremacist, and white is what they're calling the enemy, white supremacism. And I mean, I think that means that basically people who believe that white is above, like white races are better than every other race. Is that the basic? Is that, am I understanding that right? What I think they're
who is
claiming?
that person that is slated to be in charge of a major part of the Department of Justice who came out and it,
The Civil Rights Division. I can't recall her name,
yes,
but yes, she's.
I can't either. But where she said that yes, melanin is kind of the determining factor as to how smart or how athletic or how moral you are, and she went on this long rant showing that black people are just much better than white people in every way. Well, you know, here we have a genuine lunatic who's going to be in a position of going to use it. And there's lots of people like her, I think, in this Biden administration. So the tables are going to turn.
Yes, and I think by labeling people as white supremacists, by labeling them as terrorists or insurrectionists, it really depersons people, and it puts them in a category that no one that I think feels a lot like what I suspect the communist label must have felt like in the 1950s. You know, if that label gets on you, then everybody is going to just get away from you as fast as they can. Just like we saw all these tech companies immediately abandon anyone even marginally associated with it, including banks like MasterCard saying we're not going to process any campaign donations for anybody who supported, objecting to the certifying of the electors. So MasterCard choosing to not for those targeted Republicans, and
Yeah. Yeah, and of course the same thing is happening with all the social media platforms that could get completely out of control. So it becomes very hard to communicate with people at that point. So there's no assembly anymore. And you know the thing is, these things always get way out of control when two kind of conflicting cultures hate each other. Things almost always get violent. I mean, look at Latin America, for instance. Different culture than the U.S., of course, but during the dirty war in Argentina, when the generals took over and they purged the leftists, nobody knows, but it's someplace in between 10 and 40,000 people that were, dumped from helicopters in the ocean. That was a favorite method. And in Brazil, the number was somewhat less, but in that order of magnitude. Once again, nobody knows the exact number because these people were disappeared. And of course, those generals got away with it scot-free. But in Chile, because Pinochet reformed the economy using Milton Friedman's boys, and Chile became the most prosperous country in Latin America from being a nothing nowhere backwater mining province. You know, he was prosecuted as a criminal, and he only killed a couple thousand leftists. Even in little Uruguay, which has always been the most peaceful and quiet country in Latin America, when the Tupamaros were rampant down here, the generals here, everybody had generals at that time, killed about 500 people. But could that happen in the U.S.? Yeah, sure, it could happen. Except there's too many Trumpsters. I mean, so I don't know how this is going to. I don't know how this is going to work out. You know, most people aren't aware of the fact. Everybody knows about the drug lords in Colombia and the cartels, Pablo Escobar, this type of thing. But people are unaware that this really got its start after World War II with the liberals and the conservatives, and drugs weren't a big deal at that point. That came later. So they had a period in Colombia that lasted about 10 years called La Violencia. And what happened is the conservatives rode into town, and if anybody was believed to be a liberal, they got killed. Mm. And then when the the socialists came back through town, if you were still alive, you were a conservative, so you got killed. And there were whole areas of the country that were just depopulated. I mean, there were scores of thousands of people that were killed in a formalized political murder, and that's before the drug thing took over in Colombia. So I ask myself about Colombia: is that place ever really going to be stable because of this background? And it's kind of a backward society out there in the mountains, and people remember these things like the Hatfields and the McCoys do. Mm-hmm. So I hope that doesn't happen in the U.S. But look, we're having a cultural revolution in the U.S. That's what's actually going on, and it's equivalent to not one of these other things, but such as happened in France or Russia or Germany, but or in the South American countries like Colombia, but maybe it's closer to what happened in China, because the left has the reins of control now, and they're not going to let it go, because these people are different than Democrats or even leftists back in the days of Kennedy or Johnson, or, that's like ancient history these days. These people are rabid ideologues. They're not going to let go of the reins of power, any way you look at it. So yeah, we could have a great cultural revolution here, different from what went on in China, but pretty nasty by making sure that people can't get hired and can't do this and can't do that from flying and everything. I think it's on the way. It's going to happen.
I think so too.
That's my.
So let me ask you. So one of the things I heard our friend John Robb talk about was, his fourth generational warfare. He's rather than most war being fought on a kinetic basis in the future, it's going to be fought in the much more in the digital space, or even in the narrative space. Like if you basic Lao Tzu stuff, or not Lao Tzu, Sun Tzu. Totally different. You don't, if you can make your enemy feel like they've lost before there's even a battle, then there won't need to be a battle. So it's, psychological warfare, information warfare, meme warfare, essentially. And, in that, and thinking about the world in new war and in those terms, I guess, you can essentially have a holocaust of people by completely separating them from most of life, most of an economic life, and most of our lives are spent digitally. I mean, a huge portion of our life is not spent, living in the physical world. It's spent living in the digital world more and more. And if you can essentially eliminate someone's life digitally, eliminate their ability, if they're an entrepreneur, to be able to take credit card transactions, eliminate their web hosting company from allowing to host anything. Maybe you don't need to actually round people up and throw them out of helicopters into an ocean. I mean, maybe you can accomplish essentially the same thing by casting them out essentially from the digital space completely.
Well, that's absolutely right. And look what's happened. Look what happened to Jews. I mean, throughout European history, actually, starting in medieval times, that's kind of what happened to them. They were herded into ghettos. So nobody cared what they said and did with each other because they were a different society set aside like that. Maybe that's another possibility. It's hard to do that with roughly half of the country. But this is, of course, getting back to why I think that the best solution to what's going on right now, and the only nonviolent solution, is secession, where people have their own political entities so that nobody is going to impose these things on them for political reasons, because they got their own political state.
Yep. I think so too. But
So
if they demonize, if one side is demonized to the extent that it seems like the Trumpsters will be demonized, then it would be unconscionable for, I think, the left to feel that they can let them separate, because these are evil people who have evil intent and they must be stopped at all costs.
sure, sure, and it would be taking power away from themselves. So just as Lincoln wouldn't let the South separate in 1861, no, they won't. They won't let them separate. So maybe the warfare will get kinetic, as some people. But if you have control of the apparatus of the state, you're going to win. Basically, I mean, you've got the organization, you got the weapons, you got the moral authority from most people who. So no, it's just not good. But even going further back in history, in Athens, ancient Athens, at its peak, when a group or an individual, well, mostly individuals, became unpopular, they were ostracized, where the citizens would get together, thousands of them, and use little coin-like devices called ostracons as to whether somebody should be kicked out of town for 10 years. And there's all kinds of possibilities of when mob rule, people that believe in popular democracy get control.
You call them ostracons?
Yes, I believe I'm correct.
So being ostracized, that's the root of that, I assume.
Because yes, when the citizens would cast the ostracon in one amphora or the other, that would make the determination whether this guy's got to go.
That's amazing.
But this is already getting out of control, because it started out where they when they were deplatforming statues. I think they started out with Southern generals,
right?
And but since then they've moved up to just white men from a different era, like Teddy Roosevelt. I'm no fan of Teddy, but his statue was attacked in Chicago, and where's it going to end? Probably won't even end with Washington and Jefferson. They'll probably who can tell what's going to happen.
This process really works pretty well. You start with the most questionable people, and if there's not any defense made on principle for those people, then you inevitably, the edge gets pushed closer. So, deplatforming of like Alex Jones early on, probably a few years ago, where he's just kicked off of everything, and everybody's like, yeah, but Alex is kind of crazy, and so it's fine. Like, he's kind of a bad actor, and he really crossed the line with one particular incident, people thought. So they let it go, and nobody complained. And then more and more, and then ultimately the sitting president of the United States, like a coordinated effort to shut him down. I mean, it really is. I mean, everybody should be keeping a journal now. I swear. I think that these are very interesting times, and noting these things as they develop, for looking back on later, I think you'll find it very, very interesting. So,
you're right, because the victors write the history, and right now we know who the victors are, so that history, as it's written in the popular media and books that are renewed in the New York Times and so forth, that's going to put forward a very slanted view of history. So it's good that there are, other views of people that might say what's really happening.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, who knows what's really happening, because you're just looking at, even if it's, boots on the ground, you're just looking at what you're saying, as opposed to, you can't see the whole big picture. But that's the problem with history, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But I gotta believe that this is the turn of the United States to have a really bad experience, like so many countries have had in the past. I mean, I think it's our time at bat. Kind of looks that way to me.
It does. So here's the question is what to do about it, because I think that one of the things I know you and others have talked about for a long time is that there was going to be financial or economic difficulty, a collapse, you could even say, in the U.S. because of all this pent up misallocation of capital and debt and all this over so long. And what you do about a situation like that, the thought always was, have a crib outside of the U.S., have some capital outside of the U.S., stuff like that. But then when the COVID hysteria comes along, where it's like, well, the whole world now is having a different set of problems. But I have to say, in the last week or so, again, I've started to really think about the U.S. as being much more fundamentally risky than other places in the world because of this what almost feels like it's not a Bolshevik revolution, but it's something where with that sort of commitment to the outcome, it seems.
Yeah, I completely agree. That is what is going on. Yesterday I had a long lunch downtown in Punta del Este with a Rhodesian who was who left when Mugabe took over, but just caught the tail end of the war. He was a young guy, 17, when he was, and things were very sketchy then, where there were all these different white military units that were trying to preserve the old Rhodesian. So he was just in that at the tail end. Then he joined the British Army later and got into real estate and all that. But I got to say, having been through what happened in Rhodesia and saw what happened there and what's happening now in South Africa, which is going down the toilet, we were talking about where in the world do you go based upon, COVID passports now, and that's not going to end. That's going to stay there, and it's going to lead to chips they're going to put in your hand because, well, it's easier and it's better. And of course, those chips can be used for lots of things. Just COVID. I mean, they're like the chips in your cell phone. Frankly, so this is getting completely out of control. And I asked him, so where are you going to go, Paul? And here's what he came up with. He's been around the block a few times. And he said, well, I'm looking at the Turks and Caicos Islands. Well, I said, oh, that's quite interesting. Now, I've never been there, but I know a little bit about them. Been to the Bahamas a lot, all over the Bahamas, but very interesting.
What was it about it that appealed to him?
Well, there's only 14,000 citizens, so it's small. It's and members of the government in a country with only 14,000 people, everybody knows everybody else. I mean, if you need to get something done, if you got a problem, you can meet the whoever it is down at the local bar and talk to a man to man. I can't do that with Nancy Pelosi. That's out of the question.
No chance. You're a security threat, Doug. Come on, no chance.
Yeah, exactly. I've been in their data banks for many, many, many years, although they haven't done anything to me yet, oddly, happily. But so that's where he's going to go and get back into the real estate business there.
Wow.
But, I pointed out to him, I said, yeah, it's interesting. Only 14,000 citizens, and the expats that live there tend to be very upmarket because now real estate is quite expensive in the Turks and Caicos. Well, it's beautiful, it's beachfront, but it's very expensive. There's all kinds of other problems. This isn't a podcast about the Turks and Caicos, and in fact, I picked up a lot of new data, which I found quite interesting from him yesterday. But I pointed out to him that I had heard that there were actually like 20 or 30,000 Haitians, 14,000 locals, a limited number of rich expats, and there are like 20 or 30,000 Haitians that are there. And I said, how's that going to work out? Because they're not going back to Haiti, and they're not citizens, but there's more of them than there are of you. and they might get politically organized. And when they have families with children, are the kids are the kids now Turk citizens? No. The answer to that, I think, is a definite no. And the Turks don't work. The Turks and Caicos locals don't work.
Right.
So the Haitians do the dog work. And so, listen, even someplace that this guy who's used to bush wars in Africa and all that, and he said, Turks and Caicos, that's the mellowest place to be right now. I can tell you that in 20 years, there's going to be another explosion because you got two different groups that really don't like each other very much, and the one feels exploited, and they're much more numerous. So, maybe you got 20 good years there, maybe. But then where do you go? I mean, this is a problem.
I think anywhere where you have sort of a wealthy enclave that imports all of the labor and all of the products it needs to support itself is sort of recipe for disaster. I mean, if the economy is not locally self-sufficient in any way, you either need imported labor or imported products.
No,
it can't work.
No. I know. The best you can hope for is a few good years before the bad years come. Maybe that's true everywhere. Well,
that's true.
Switzerland has been a kind of an example of, but Switzerland's kind of an uptight, constipated little place, quite frankly.
Listen, I have to say, last time I was there, which was 2 years ago, there were a lot of burqa-wearing people on the streets that were definitely not the norm. Not what I saw even 2 years before that in Geneva.
Oh yeah, that's right. I mean, the last time I was there, and how long ago would that have been? 3 or 4, something like that. I mean, I walked out of my hotel looking to get a meal, walked into a restaurant, turned out to be a Turkish restaurant. And I was the only Westerner there. Everybody else was a Turk. So, it's, but of course, those people are never going to be Swiss citizens. That's just not going to happen. So they can be evicted if they get terribly unruly. But that's not like the situation in France, which is about 20% Muslim, or Belgium, where it's more than 20%, and they've become citizens. It's the whole world is. Look, when the economy goes down, which it is, I think it's going to be a really bad depression. That's when the cat's going to get out of the bag, and all these social and demographic problems manifest themselves, set off by the economy, and then it becomes political. And so this is we're looking at and you know what, Paul had not heard this when I told him this yesterday. I said, did you hear about the American in the 1930s that saw World War II coming? And he was looking for some place where he's just not going to get hurt by. So he said, I need an island, and an island that's got, some cattle and copra and fish and got some land and labor and all that. So where does he go? He goes to the Solomon Islands, goes to Guadalcanal. So you never know.
You never know, but I think the key is to increase your options at this point, right? You just want to make sure you have as many options as possible while there's still, and maybe it's even too late for a lot of things right now. But I think making sure flexibility.
Getting late, yeah, because the prices of places that you might want to go outside of the country, like in Turks and Caicos, just in the last year, he says average prices of land, good land, is approximately tripled.
It's unbelievable.
That's shocking. So it's certainly happening all over the U.S. in small, delightful towns like Aspen, which I don't consider to be delightful anymore because it's a people's republic that's going to be suffering from class warfare. But, smaller towns that aren't as shishi, prices are going up a lot. Prices are collapsing in New York and San Francisco and places like that.
So one of the thought that I just wanted to run by you, the thought, why these revolutions get why they end up eating their young. it just seems maybe all the energy behind them is having a common enemy, as my current hypothesis, and that the regime in power, unless they can focus people's energy on some sort of enemy of some kind, then it's setting itself up for an internal collapse. That the revolution fails. It's essentially that the leaders that are installed end up failing. So I was just thinking that the momentum of certainly the left at this point is they're on the same page because of Trump. Trump is the common enemy, and it feels like if they don't have him as an enemy, or his legacy is somehow as an enemy, then even their own coalition would collapse. So they need an enemy, and so because of that, you have to believe that I believe then there's going to be an enemy. There's going to be an enemy that's very clear and defined at all times in order to basically maintain the cohesion of the left.
Yep, that's absolutely right. I mean, that's what happened, between Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin. I mean, they were all on the same page philosophically, all good brothers in arms, but once they got in power, different story. Because these people are all about political power. And I think, as I mentioned the last time we talked, that this is actually right out of Mussolini's playbook, where this is actually what fascism is all about, as defined by Mussolini: political power, economic power, the state and the corporations. And it's funny because, Ayn Rand, who really one of the great intellectuals of the last century, no question about it, and she saw the big corporations and business as being the friend. But no, they're not. I mean, they're interested in money, kind of like the government helping them make that money. But big corporations are not free market type things. They're like the guys in Silicon Valley are showing themselves to be. And it's a perfect Mussolini formula, the melding of political power and economic power, corporations and the government. And you got it all when you got those two things.
Right.
Frankly.
I mean, communism is not a great substitute for that. I mean, communism, you end up basically destroying assets. I think that was kind of proven. And then, so even people, it seems like it's a much more foolproof plan, essentially, to keep the big corporations in power, allow them to, make enormous amounts of money, make it even easier for them in some cases, but require of them certain conduct that supports the state.
Just like George Orwell, when he had, Boxer the horse, who was, working harder for the revolution than anybody on Animal Farm. And, after he could no longer pull his weight, they sent him off to the knacker. So that's pretty much the way it works. It's, we're in for such tough times. I hate to be so gloomy. I don't see any way out of it.
Yeah, I don't see any way out of it either. But I think recognizing that what is happening and putting it in some sort of historical context at least allows people to make better decisions. Because one of the things that I've seen, at least in the Twitter world, they say, when they start blocking people or banning people, it must mean that you're over the target. It must mean that they're worried. And I think I don't think that this is the exertion of power by the left and corporations working hand in hand today is not about because they're afraid of that the truth will come out or something. It's because they are committed to essentially expunging from the conversation, from what they would consider polite conversation, people who have different views. And it's not about fear.
I agree. I agree. They're going to do it because they can do it. And, it turns out in the U.S., the red people and the blue people actually hate each other. So, yeah, that's what you want to do to somebody you hate. And that's what's happened in all these other countries that I mentioned earlier. Eventually you just do something bad to whoever you perceive as the enemy.
Okay. All right. On that happy note, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.